Welcome to the 66th episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host Vicki can't be with us today, but it's an honor and pleasure to welcome back my longtime friend, Dr. Nancy Knowlton. Nancy, who graduated Harvard and taught at Yale, is the former Sant Chair of Marine Science at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, where, among other things, she was the founder and leader of the Earth Optimism movement, and we'll get into that. She's the author of Citizens of the Sea, based on the decade-long census of marine life that she also helped lead. She founded the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography with her husband and former podcast guest, Dr. Jeremy Jackson. And I could go on about your resume, but let's just start with basics, Nancy. When did you first connect with the ocean?
Oh, I first connected with the ocean when I was pretty small because both my grandmother on one side of the family and my grandparents on the other, they actually had houses on either side of Long Island Sound. So I spent a lot of my summer sort of wandering around the pebbly beaches of Long Island Sound, turning over boulders and swimming and fishing for crabs with a little bit of broken open mussel. So it goes way back.
So you grew up on the beaches of Long Island Sound and the cobblestone beaches of parts of it. And when you were growing up, what was your orientation when you went, got out of high school, went to college? What were you thinking in terms of life direction?
I knew by then I wanted to be a biologist. Actually, I started off wanting to be an astronomer, and I had a telescope when I was little, and I found discovered. I did, other people obviously knew about it, but I discovered for myself a comet in the sky and watched it get the tail grow, and I loved looking at the rings of Saturn and that sort of thing. But I think eventually I came to realize that I didn't really have the skill set to be an astronomer, and then I had a wonderful high school teacher in biology, so that's when I really wanted to be a biologist. But I spent most of at first I wanted to be a microbiologist, and then I transferred from Smith to Harvard, and I took a class from E.O. Wilson and also classes from Steve Gould. So a very distinguished educational pedigree. And that's how I started to get really interested in whole organisms rather than little tiny things. And but it wasn't until I worked for a year after I graduated for a woman named Dr. Ruth Turner. She was the first woman to go down in Alvin, deep sea, and I worked as her research assistant for a year, and I just kind of absorbed marine biology from her, and that's where finally, having spent a lot of my childhood in the next to the ocean, in the ocean, I finally started connected to what I could do for a living.
So, and how did you go about it once you determined that you wanted biology, and your teacher had, as you said, been the first woman to go down on Alvin, the deep ocean submersible? What were your first steps into the wet, salty 71% of our planet?
Well, when I was working for Ruth Turner, she encouraged me to learn how to scuba dive. So I learned to dive in the waters of Massachusetts, which aren't really necessarily the easiest place. It's not really the easiest place to learn to dive. It was really cold, and you couldn't see much farther than your hand at the end of your arm. But I did learn to dive, and then I went to grad school at the University of California at Berkeley, where there's a big diving program, marine. A lot of people doing marine science, and still, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted. I knew I wanted to do something in the ocean. And that was back in the heyday of animal behavior. So I was sort of for a while, I was interested in octopus behavior, which is a pretty cool topic. But then I pretty quickly figured out that octopus were kind of hard to work with, hard to catch, hard to keep. And so for one reason or another, I was
they were escape artists.
Yes, yeah, they're definitely escape artists. So when I was trying to catch octopus, while I was doing that, there were all these snapping shrimp, and that's how I wound up working on snapping shrimp. And they're tropical, so I wound up taking a class in Discovery Bay, Jamaica, and that's how I got introduced to coral reefs. So it was kind of one thing, it really, when you think of it back from when I was 6 to when I was in grad schools, it was a lot of little decision points, but none of them were very organized. It's not like I had a clear goal and I was heading toward it the whole time. It was more a series of stepping stones, never really knowing where the next stepping stone was going to be.
And yet the clearest sign yet of your intelligence is you moved from diving in Massachusetts to scuba diving in California to Jamaica.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's back in the days when I was diving in Jamaica, of course, the reefs were spectacular. They weren't perfectly pristine. We knew that well, for example, there were no big fish at all on the reefs, even in the 1970s. And that's due to the fact that, Jamaica is a poor country, and just a little bit of subsistence fishing can really take out most of the fish, especially when you've got a pretty narrow band of shallow water, which is what is the case for the north coast of Jamaica. So it doesn't go out very far, and just a handful of fishermen can really fish out most everything. So even back then, there were no big fish. They're just little tiny fish. But the corals were beautiful, and we didn't make a connection between the health of the fish, or the lack of the health of the fish, and the health of the corals. And then various things happened, and the reefs themselves collapsed over a course of just a couple of years. But I saw them before, as I say, I didn't see them before people, but I did see them while the corals themselves were spectacular. Those places are actually hard to find now.
And you did a lot of the original science, kind of looking at how coral reefs thrive or fail to thrive.
Well, I certainly did some. I mean, there are a lot of people working on that problem. Because I saw what happened in Jamaica was there was a big hurricane that came by and just bashed everything to pieces. And so we actually tagged a lot of survivors, and then all the survivors died as well. And then we tagged more survivors, was still left, and those also mostly died. And it turned out to be a combination of predators, which we could see right then. There, all these things that love to eat the coral. There wasn't that much coral left, so they were sort of glomming onto the few pieces that were left. And so they were really doing a number on the survivors. And then what we didn't realize at the time was there's a disease sweeping through the Caribbean. So a lot of things were dying for reasons we couldn't really quite figure out. So
who were the coral predators?
Coral predators, there's a little snail called Coralliophila, and there is a fireworm, which actually swallows the tips of branching. What we were studying at the time, we were mostly studying the branching corals, the staghorn coral, and they swallow the staghorn coral sort of like sword swallowers. They open their mouths and kind of crawl down the with the branch tip, and then they just crawl down with their mouths open, and they digest, and they sit there for a while and digest away the living tissue on the outside of the coral. And then damselfish don't really so much eat the coral, but they kill the coral because they like to grow seaweed gardens, and so they'll peck at the coral and kill it. So those three things together did a real number on the small number of survivors from Hurricane Ellen.
And then the diseases came, which also was happening in the Florida.
Yeah, and the diseases actually were going on even then, but there were things that were dying for reasons we didn't know, but at the time we didn't realize that this big epidemic was sweeping through the Caribbean and killing all the branching corals. So that actually had a huge impact as well, though we only really figured that after the fact. So it really showed us that we were expecting the reefs to bounce back. This staghorn coral in particular grows really fast, and it's pre-adapted to sort of grow back from little pieces. And so even though the hurricane kind of smashed it up a lot, the reason we tagged the survivors is we thought they were going to grow back, and then what we learned was they didn't. They really have never really recovered to the way they were back in the 1970s.
So while studying in the Caribbean, you're also hooked up with, or actually married, Dr. Jeremy Jackson. And for a time, as you were studying the decline of coral species, you became known as Doctors Gloom and Doom. How does one square the global decline of corals with eco-optimism?
Yeah, well, corals are not where you'd start for ocean optimism, earth optimism, whatever you want to call it. But there are, even though I was watching a lot of bad things happen, and certainly to the reefs in Jamaica and the Caribbean generally, I did actually spend some time in places where the reefs were still spectacularly healthy. The Central Pacific in particular is so remote that there's no fishing, there's no pollution, there are no people basically. And those reefs, when I visited them, this was before global mass bleaching, were also still spectacular. So there are still places where you could see what things would look like if you reduce the human impacts on the reefs. But really, I think the motivation was not so much the examples on reefs, which, as I say, that's not where you'd start when you're trying to be optimistic about the ocean. Just teaching students. When I got to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, we actually started this program we started something called the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, and we had a whole master's and PhD program associated with it. And part of that program was to bring in not only biologists, but also economists, anthropologists. It was a very cool mix of natural science and social science, because we felt that you couldn't solve ocean problems without having them both together, which is true. And so we would start, because it was such a, these people really didn't have that much common in terms of their training or what they knew about. So we'd start with a course in the summer. It was kind of boot camp for biodiversity and conservation of the ocean. And it was, Jeremy and I would give these lectures about the state. We'd start with the state of the ocean. It seemed kind of a logical way of starting, like things are really bad and they seem to be getting worse. What are we going to do about it? But the reality was that when you start off with all that bad news, it's really hard to then shed it, to think about what to do about it. In fact, there have been really interesting social science experiments shown that people who, if you start with bad news, it's really hard to move to good news. Whereas if you start with good news and then move to bad news, the bad news sticks. So bad news is much stickier than good news. So I started thinking about these students. I started thinking about the program as kind of medical school for the ocean. And so the students were going to be, future ocean doctors. But then I realized, wow, we're spending all this time on all this bad stuff, and we're teaching our students to write these basically ocean obituaries. And yet when you go to medical school, you don't train students to write obituaries of people, even though, of course, we all get obituaries at the end, and much sooner than the ocean will get an obituary. And so I started thinking, well, this is just not the right approach. And so that's what led to a series of symposia called Beyond the Obituaries, Success Stories in Ocean Conservation. And the reaction to that change of, how to talk about problems was so dramatic. I had many students come up to me, say, I almost left the field of marine conservation because it was so depressing. And you've really made me realize that there's something I can do, and this is a meaningful career. And so it has just continued from that point on.
Now, this is before we get further into that. When you and Jeremy started the program at Scripps, it really was bringing biology back to U.S. oceanography. The context that I wrote about in Blue Frontier was oceanographers like Roger Revelle and Walter Monk helped the Navy in World War II and helped win the war, really. Walter Monk gave Eisenhower the right date for landings for D-Day. But after the war, the Navy pretty much took over U.S. oceanography. A lot of physical oceanographers came to the fore, and biology was sort of left by the side until the end of the Cold War. They were out there helping the Navy chase Russian submarines, but not noticing the state of corals and kelp. So just talk about biology's role in understanding the ocean.
Well, of course, we got there a lot sooner than the end, a lot later than the end of the Cold War. We got there in 1998. And it's not the case that there was no biology at Scripps when we got there. Paul Dayton and Mia Tegner were both really distinguished marine biologists working at Scripps. And there were quite a few people working on microbes, very distinguished program in microbiology at Scripps. And then Lisa Levin working actually everything from salt marshes to deep sea. So there were a lot of biologists there. In fact, there was actually a lot of conservation there. But it was the whole wasn't greater than the sum of its parts, because everybody was off doing their own things. And so there was no synergy. And so when we created the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, what we did was sort of create a common place where people could get together, talk, jointly train students, and then provided an opportunity to raise money. A really important program from the NSF, which at the time was called IGERT, Interdisciplinary Graduate Education and Research Training. And so we got one of those grants. We had set up a master's degree program, and the result was suddenly there was this kind of synergy going on between these different people. So it's not like the pieces weren't there. It's just the pieces weren't they weren't helping each other. And so I think that's really what our contribution was to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And with this focus on solutions, which was ultimately what really made it work.
You did a lot of interesting synergy. As I said, you brought together one conference with journalists, historians, and scientists from the marine sector. You did a lot of interesting stuff that hadn't been tried. What was the outcome of all that?
Well, that's really, I mean, that those were the sessions that you referred to, I think, were with a grant from the Sloan Foundation, and their sort of known, unknown, unknowable program. And so it led to, so that was sort of, I mean, first of all, we created the center deliberately as an interdisciplinary center. And then the thing is, though, when you create a center, you have to have something going on. And something going on usually requires some kind of funding source. So really we had that series of 3 symposia, which generated a lot of intellectual energy. And then we got the grant from the National Science Foundation, and also figured out how to train master's degree students as well. And so that brought in funds, allow us to do all sorts of other things. So it was a combination of the basic idea was for it to be a solutions-driven interdisciplinary program. And then it became a reality when we started to have these programs that actually had real money attached to them.
And you built a kind of conservation science that when you were coming up, I know when Sylvia and others, applied science was kind of a dirty word, that the idea of taking your science and applying it to the real world and coming up with conservation solutions, that was kind of looked down upon when you were, say, a graduate student, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was actually, definitely as a grad student, because that's the dark ages. That was in the 1970s. Really, in some ways, the more arcane and obscure the problem you were working on, the better. But that, things it would have been, by the time we got to Scripps, it was, but almost, the new millennium. By then, you could see a lot of warning signs about things not being right with the planet in general and the ocean in particular. But it was still the case that there was kind of a suspicion about doing something that was too applied in the biological sciences. It's funny, I don't think it is true for the physical sciences in some ways. But so when Jeremy wrote his big paper on overfishing, he got a certain amount of pushback even from colleagues at Scripps saying, "Oh, we don't do that kind of science. That's a little too close to solving a problem." But really, the currents are beginning to shift very strongly in the direction of solutions-based science. Even back then, just because you could see, the problems are much larger now, but you could see even back then, over 20 years ago, that there were a lot of problems and that they were clearly not going to go away.
Right. And the job of science is not to have real-time video documentation of an ecosystem's collapse.
Well, for a while, that's what we actually did a really good job of. That was where the beyond the obituaries idea came from, was that, we were doing such a good job at documenting the collapse and the decline and making predictions about future collapses and future further declines. And we weren't really paying enough attention to what to do about it. I think that's the biggest contribution the interdisciplinary approach at the time was actually quite revolutionary. I won't say we were the very first, no one else had ever thought of doing things that way, but we were certainly one of the first major programs to deliberately bring together the natural sciences and the social sciences. And then, and that just by doing that sort of shifted the emphasis to solutions. And then, as I said, I had this insight that, we had to move beyond the obituaries. We really had to focus on what we can do about the problems rather than the problems themselves.
Right. To use your analogy, you don't start medical school training by taking them into the morgue to see the dead corals.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we did when we started, because we gave these lectures, which was all about death and destruction. And so you could sort of get this vibe that this was, even back then, that students really wanted more than that. And they didn't, that really wasn't why they entered the program. But it took us old folks a little while to figure it out.
And then when you went to Smithsonian, you actually sort of expanded the concept to this ocean optimism or earth optimism.
Well, actually, what I took to the Smithsonian when I moved there was the idea of beyond the obituaries. And in fact, the first Beyond the Obituaries symposium was held at the Smithsonian. So this was an idea that was kind of developing while I was at Scripps, but it was still sort of developing. And then I knew I was moving to the Smithsonian, and I applied for a small grant to run this symposium. It was kind of a pre-symposium to the main International Marine Conservation Congress. And it was the first one. And that meeting itself was not at the Smithsonian, but we held this one-day symposium at the Smithsonian called Beyond the Obituary: Success Stories in Ocean Conservation. And when I was planning it, actually, I got a certain amount of pushback. In fact, I remember one person said, you can't possibly have a whole day of a meeting on success stories in ocean conservation because there aren't that many successes to talk about. And in the end, we had so many submissions that we basically had to make it speed dating for ocean solutions. So no one was allowed to talk for more than 6 minutes. So that was super successful. And I had one person in particular write me and say, "You've changed the way I think about my science. You've changed the way I teach conservation. I'm just not going to do anything the same since being part of this. It was revolutionary for me." And not everyone, there are a lot of people that felt like that. They didn't all write to me, of course, but it really did change the sort of tenor of marine conservation, because that has been a big problem all along. There are a lot of successes out there, but so many of them are either published in kind of hard to find places, or even when they're published, say, in major media outlets, because of the news cycle, they're they're visible for 24 or 48 hours, and then they sink below the surface because some other news story has replaced them. So
could you give me 3 just basic examples of ocean solutions you see working?
Sure. So, one solution that clearly works is our marine protected areas, and also they're not only marine protected areas, but regulations to stop harvesting certain kinds of marine organisms. Whales are a perfect example. I mean, there's still some very bad news in the whale department. The North Atlantic right whale, which is near where I live here in Maine, is in very serious trouble. But whales around the globe are actually, however, recovering, in some cases back to pre-whaling levels, and so that's a really dramatic example. And then I think in terms of cleaning up pollution, there are some real examples. Tampa Bay is a classic example where the seagrasses were in terrible shape, and then the citizens got together and cleaned up the water going into Tampa Bay, and eventually, and it wasn't easy. It's not like it happened really quickly, but over the course of a couple decades, the seagrasses rebounded to sort of the levels they were in the 1950s. And then the other thing that I think is really...
So just those are like marine protected areas, or like national parks in the sea, areas of no take. And now there's a global movement to create 30% of the land and the ocean as marine protected or protected areas, really. Save the Whales worked as a movement. The whales are coming back. And when you reduce pollution, things tend to get rebounded.
Yes. And then there's a huge effort now on restoration, because I think people recognize that because so much damage was done, some cases it's really important to sort of jumpstart the recovery process. And so there have been really interesting examples of the restoration of shellfish beds in Long Island, or seagrass beds off the coast of Virginia. And there are lots and lots of work being done now. Here we can turn back to corals. There's a huge amount of work being done on coral restoration. I think that's still not clear exactly. I mean, the biggest problem is when you restore something, you've got to have gotten rid of the original problem, because otherwise it'll just go back to the way it was. And of course, with corals now, climate change is the biggest problem. So, but people are working in very interesting ways to figure out types of corals that are more resilient to future global changes in ocean conditions. So I wouldn't say corals were the best example for restoration, but they're sort of a fringe, the kind of cutting edge example. But there are lots of other types of organisms which have been restored successfully. So protection, cleaning up, and restoration are huge examples. Then, of course, there's the whole role the ocean can play in generating renewable energy, which that's not really biology, but it's very interesting that ocean
winds are consistent, offshore wind, and the work being done on ocean wave energy, tidal, the OTEC, ocean thermal.
So, really, when you think about it, there are all these examples. None of them are yet big enough and numerous and large enough. And we're kind of in a race against time. The reality is, we're trying to save as much as we can and restore as much as we can, but we're also racing against climate change and making us, change really bending the curve, as they used to say about COVID, in the emissions department. And that's a race against time. But I don't know. It's hard to know how it'll come out. I mean, we're going to lose stuff. There's no question we're going to lose things. But the more we can do to sort of save what we can, increase resilience of what's left, rebuild things. I mean, it won't be perfect. It won't be like it was before. But to do nothing would be so much worse.
I'm more frustrated than despairing because we know what the solutions are. It's creating the political will to enact them. So what do you see as the intersection now between science and policy?
I think the main thing is you say it's science and policy. It's science, policy, and economics. Because what's really interesting, I think, is particularly in the climate change front, is how rapidly it has become the case that renewable energy makes sense, not just for the planet and not just for reducing air pollution, which is good for us, but just because it's cheaper. And there was a great article, for example, in the New York Times just a couple of days ago about how school districts around the country are actually paying their teachers more with the money they're saving from putting solar panels on their roof, and also doing other sorts of cool things for the community. So when you start getting that kind of dynamic kicking in, then change can happen really fast. And to your point, we really don't know what it's going to be like even 10 years from now, much less. I mean, one of the things that drives me and Jeremy and other people crazy is the sort of focus on 2100, because I have to say, we just don't have a clue as to what 2100 is going to be like when change has the potential to happen so quickly. I mean, 2100 is, a long way away. And so I think projections about business as usual in 2100 are almost meaningless at this point.
Yeah, it's like in talking about our inability to project the future. I use the example of the 1990, the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, totally underestimated the impacts we'd already be seeing in the summer of 2022. This is a catastrophic summer in terms of impacts.
It can surprise us in bad ways and good ways. I mean, it can surprise us in good ways in the sense that I think no one really anticipated even 10 years ago how quickly renewable energy could potentially take off. And I mean, I think we're just at that point of, exponential change.
Right. We're at the pivot where today solar and wind are cheaper energy sources than any of the fossils, and also more labor intensive, more job generating. The challenges now are less, as you said, economic than political.
That's right.
What kind of backlash from either side have you gotten as you've both as a scientist and as a ocean optimist?
The most backlash I've gotten, I'd have to say, was from other scientists and sort of their analogs in the general public, but I hear more, I guess, maybe from the scientists. What happens is that for certain people, they're just so wedded to talking about what's not working, the imminent collapse of everything, that they feel that talking about anything that is working, that might be a help to confronting the problem and actually resolving it and solving it, distracts the public from thinking hard about the enormity of the crisis we're facing. And so I once got an email I was copied on this email, I think deliberately, and the person was very, very famous ecologist who I won't name.
But, oh, come on, you.
No, I won't name him. But he said something like, people who participated in optimism events should be ashamed of themselves. This was in connection with how at the Smithsonian, once we launched Ocean Optimism, we then wound up pretty quickly in the context of sort of general interest in conservation at the Smithsonian, expanding it to not just oceans, but Earth Optimism. And so we were organizing this Earth Optimism Summit, which was going to take place in 2017. And I got this email saying, basically saying, you should be ashamed of yourself. It was phrased a little bit more indirectly.
How dare you be hopeful?
And so how dare you be hopeful? And how dare you convey to anyone that there's any reason whatsoever for hope? And I think that's just so counterproductive. It becomes completely self-fulfilling, because if people feel that there's nothing they can do, they will do nothing. I mean, it's very, very clear connection between too much bad news and disengagement, apathy, and just tuning out.
And especially with the ocean, as you know, it's this balancing of the wonder and the warning. I mean, it's all that we still have to lose, even as we've lost much already.
Oh yeah, things could get much, much, much worse than they are right now, and they will get much, much, much worse if we just sort of say it's hopeless and give up. I think the thing that underpins conservation around the world, conservation that works, is trust. And it's that ability to trust somebody else in working together towards a solution that really makes things happen. In the absence of trust, actually, things really tend to fall apart.
One more thing you wrote Citizens of the Sea, which is a great narrative picture book of all the odd and interesting finned folks you meet in the ocean. So you got any other writing plans in your future, or?
Yes, well, I am working on a book. As you do a better job finishing books than I do. I've only written the one, Citizens of the Sea, but I am working on a book on success stories in conservation, sort of the theme of Earth optimism, basically, telling the stories of what's working, why it's working, and how to get more working.
Tremendous. Well, Nancy Knowlton, thank you so much for joining me once again on Rising Tide, the Ocean podcast.
My pleasure. Ask me anytime. I'm always happy to chat.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein, with support from Natasha Benjamin and Ellie Curlow. Rising Tide's editing services and additional technical support is provided by Studio Cape May. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbarg. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at www.bluefront.org or download it from Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.